at the conference. But this year she's going to tell us what's up with inflation and input prices. And I thought this was really timely to just kind of find out what's going on with some of the supply chain issues that you've heard about, the inflation, and how that might be affecting you, and so how you can make plans. And then, so take it away, Kinda, and then we'll come back with the rest of our afternoon.
Great. Thanks so much, Ruby. Yeah, I'm Dr. Kinda Curtis. I'm the State Extension Ag and Food Marketing Specialist. I work a lot with growers who market direct to consumer, so farmers markets, CSAs, those types of things in my extension appointment. And yeah, I did a presentation similar to this at our quarterly Ag Outlook webinar a couple of weeks ago. And so Ruby asked me to come back and spend more time and expand on this. As she mentioned, if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. And as I get towards the end of my presentation, we'll go through those and answer as many as we can, given the time given. And the rest I can answer after that. I'm one of 5 presentations today. We have 5 different presenters, of course, some similar related topics. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about what is going on nationally, so in the United States with inflation. We'll look at some historic inflation rates and talk a little bit about what drives inflation in general, and how things may change or not in the coming year. I'll spend most of my time looking more at food issues because we are at the Urban Small Farms Conference. And so most of you are dealing with food products, vegetables, fruits, those types of things. And some of you perhaps some of commodities, some wheat, some things like that, but they're probably most interested. And I'll be talking about a large array of the food products. I think also it's important that we look at not only what's going on with inflation in terms of consumer prices, but also what producers are getting at the farm gate. And there's actually some good news there. And that's the upside for producers. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the input prices increases that we're seeing and some shortages, and then some suggestions on how to maybe not necessarily combat, but deal with it in a way that might be helpful. I will say that given the events in Russia and Ukraine that went on today may change things and impact things, and I did not take that into consideration in putting that today. So something to think about. There is some discussion on some of the boards that, especially for commodity prices like wheat and those types of things, there may be some significant impacts in the short term due to the Ukraine crisis. Okay, so you may have seen a number of news articles, things on social media about surging food prices and prices in general and inflation. And again, I would suggest that those things are being put out there to cause media attention, but to open them and read them thoroughly. So just to give you an overview, we have seen basically an increase in prices across the country of about 7% between December 20 and December 2021. And these are steeper than we've seen in many years since June of 1982. And a lot of those increases have been felt in the food sector and also in the energy sector. So when we take those things out of consumer price inflation, we have a 5.5% increase between December 20 and December 21, which is obviously less than 7%, but lower, but still fairly high. And so we haven't seen a 5.5% increase since February of 1991. Specifically for food, and I'll talk more in depth about this in a minute, food prices have climbed about 6.3%, but if you look at only grocery prices at 6.5%. Energy is where we've seen a lot of increases, almost 30% over the past year, so December 20, December 21, and so those are really impacting the food sector in terms of transportation and those types of things. But again, I think it's important to point out that prices are still nowhere near the historic highs from the 80s. And in fact, we had inflation in the early 80s of close to 15%. So again, more than twice of what we're seeing now. So here in this graph, you see historical inflation rates since the 50s. And then you can see that there were pretty large spikes here in the late 70s and early 80s. Sorry, I have a computer that is fairly sensitive to minor movements with the mouse here. And then we saw some fall off, of course, in the 90s and 2000s. We had after the, I guess you would call it the downturn in the economy in the late 2010s, so 2010, 2011, even what we would call reverse inflation. So that's what goes negative there, under 0%. And then, of course, as of late 2021, we had increased 7.1%. There's a lot of reasons for this, and I'll talk about some of those coming. Okay. So what are some of the drivers and how might inflation change over in general over the coming year or two? Okay, so Deloitte put together these great graphics, and so I'm going to use some of them here. And a lot of it depends on these four things and how they evolve. So the first one is how long will supply chain disruptions last? Okay. The positive news might be that it's temporary, say less than a year, and supply is able to expand. So that would bring inflation rates down. The negative would be that it's long lasting, say more than 3 years, and therefore supply would remain constrained. And so we would continue to see higher prices. If you've taken an Econ 101 class ever in high school or college, you know that when we restrict supply, okay, we see prices go up. They're just a simple supply demand graphs. The second one is people's expectations about inflation and how that impacts the wages that they're going to require to work. And they may be new negotiations, or they may be negotiations between existing contracts. And again, on the positives of reducing inflation would be that, basically expectations are not high, that inflation will continue, and so people don't ask for increased wages. On the negative, people have high expectations of inflation, and so they demand higher wages in order to maintain the same lifestyle, the same amount of spending. And that leads to the third one, which is very similar, which is how does consumer spending habits evolve? On the positive, if they rebalance, maybe people start using some of that pandemic related savings that runs out, or they, start with the online ordering that's massive right now. If that's to calm down, that would bring inflation down. On the negative, if people have a heightened demand for goods and services like we're seeing now, then inflation may continue. And then finally, the fourth one, what's the nature of monetary policy? So monetary policy is basically spending by the government or interest rates. There's a number of ways that the government can conduct monetary policy, but if they basically accommodate and keep interest rates low, that would be positive. If they increase interest rates and increase bond purchases, that would be a negative. So those are the four main things highlighted by Deloitte. They also pointed out some other things that also could potentially drive inflation in the future. Of course, the impact of media on people's expectations of inflation. Changes in people's savings rates. People were not able to travel, not maybe able to go out to eat, and people were saving more than they had in the past due to the pandemic. That may fall off as we open up more and the restrictions related to the pandemic go down. There could be effects on supply chain diversification, changes in housing, these types of things. And I won't read all of these, but as you can see, there's a plethora of things that can positively or negatively impact inflation. One of the major worries right now is that we may try to overcorrect and actually end up with negative inflation in the near future. So taking too much of a time to change it. And so Deloitte also put this together, and this kind of includes this idea of what could possibly happen depending on the situation. And they've kind of done this in the weather report, which I like. So the most optimal situation is what they're calling blue skies. And as you can see there, that's in the quadrant of the graph next to it where you have a stronger economic outlook, but inflation is relatively low. And that's current inflation is temporary and reverts to recent historical norms, which are approximately 2% annually. Labor supply stabilizes, and we have what we call gradual interest rate increases. Probably the second best prediction would be what they call sun showers, where inflation settles at 3 to 4%. And supply chain disruptions persist a little bit, but labor supply remains somewhat constrained. Again, a little bit higher inflation rate, a little less strong economy, but still in the positive quadrant. Then there's two negative potential inflation weather reports, and they're in the negative part of the quadrant. You can see, so the weak economy. Probably the best of this one is what I would call the downdraft, because it's less inflation. And so we have this idea of disinflation, which I mentioned earlier, where we basically overcompensate. And so resolution of supply chain disruptions, and then also diminished consumer demand. And then we basically are in a low growth situation because we have less demand, more supply. And so prices fall, interest rates come down. And so we end up in a more negative economic situation. And then probably the worst one here is what they're calling stormy weather, which is where you have a fairly weak economy, but you also have high inflation. And so this is inflation rises 8 to 9%. As inflation becomes embedded in worker expectations and called a wage price spiral, that's an economics term, and we have this sluggish economy. So as you can see, depending on how things play out, okay, we could possibly over the next couple of years land in one of these potential scenarios. I think that there's still a lot to be seen and see how things will play out, and especially with world events. And so we'll see what happens. Okay, so specifically to food, and I'll be basically focusing on food and ag products for the rest of my presentation today. I'll just keep an eye on the time. This consumer price index, so that is basically a basket of food, and it has a number of items, and it's the type of items stay fairly consistent. But basically what USDA does is they measure how the changes and the cost of that basket of food changes from year to year. And that's called the consumer price index for food. And as I mentioned earlier, it's about 6.1% higher, okay, change between 20 and 21. Okay, so on average, this basket of food increased by 6.3%, but it kind of depended on where the food was purchased. And so I think this is an interesting thing to point out, is that, you know, if you were consuming food away from home more, I mean, we used to be at food away from home consumption rates in the high 50s before the pandemic, and that obviously went down temporarily because of restaurant closures and capacity constraints. So that those prices increased 5.8%. But that was lower than actually the food purchased to consume at home, so through grocery stores, and that was 6.4%. So it kind of depends, you know, where the food was purchased and consumed. So I guess some of the good news here is that the cost of food at restaurants actually didn't change as much as that we saw at the grocery stores. So this is food price outlook that is provided by USDA Economic Research Service. And there's a lot of information here, but I just wanted to highlight what we saw in terms of different food products. And so I've got, if you see that, I've got that kind of one of those middle columns. It says year over year, December 2020 to December 21% change. I've got that highlighted with a green box around it. See that? And so that is basically telling us for each of these different food products what the percentage change was in the year. And you can see here that beef and veal was by far the biggest change, so up almost 19%. And that was followed by pork, and even meats and poultry, 12%. And so you can see that as far as the cost of food at home in terms, it was the meats and poultries and fish that really took a huge increase, and also eggs at 11%. Down in the lower part of the graph, we see that fats and oils, 8.8%, and then fresh fruits went up quite a bit at 7.9%. The others, some of them are a little higher than average, but not nearly the changes that we saw with the meats. I think this is interesting. We have a colleague, Purdue, Jason Lusk. He put this graph together where basically it's looking at what would be the cost to produce, starting not to produce, but to purchase for consumers different food products based upon minutes worked. And this is per year, it's the median weekly salary for an individual in the United States. And as you can see here, even in 2021, which is basically the very end of the graph, I'm sorry it's not mentioned here, but there's 2020 and then there's blank. That should be 2021. Anyway, you can see that for some things, even at the end of 2021, the cost in terms of minutes worked was actually still lower for things like 20 loaves of bread, which is the yellow line. Still lower for 20-pound turkey, which is the heavy blue line. And also quite a bit lower for the 10-pound ham, especially from those 90s prices, 1990. And then a couple of things are up. One thing that's up a little bit was 50-pound potatoes. That's up a little bit from the early 2000s, late 90s. And then, of course, as you can see, that blue dotted line, that 4 pounds of sirloin steak was pretty average up until the end of 20, and then that headed up. And so you could see that over time, you know, the minutes you would have to work to actually buy these things has gone down generally, with a few exceptions in the last year or two. Okay. So what's going on in terms of what's really driving increased food prices? Well, we have two things going on at the same time that, again, when you look at those Econ 101, demand and supply graphs, okay, is that we have consumer demand increases higher and we also have supply lower. And that's kind of the double whammy of increased pricing. And so on the consumer side, we're seeing labor shortages and so increased wages. I've seen signs up for wages at places that seem like they're 2 or 3 times what they used to be, maybe not in the last 4 or 5 years, but certainly when I was looking at those jobs, little more than a few years ago. And so obviously where they're able, okay, businesses are having to pay higher wages, and those wages, of course, those people end up using those wages to spend money. We've also had a lot of increases in government spending, and anytime you have that, you put a lot of money into the economy and it increases demand. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people saved more than usual due to the pandemic because they weren't able to go out, they weren't able to travel. And another thing is we're also seeing, according to some data, a lot of consumer optimism right now, which I think is actually positive in terms of, getting some control over inflation in the future and the economy. But all of those are really driving people to purchase more, especially online ordering is huge right now. And so when demand goes up, prices go up. Okay. At the same time, we've got lower supply of things, and a lot of that has to do with the inability of labor or extra expensive labor. So our firm's costs have gone up. Okay, and so they're going to provide less of what they're providing, whether it's restaurant food or whether it's cream cheese, whatever they're producing. When their costs go up, they're going to provide less. Also because of shortages in terms of fuel prices, especially packing materials. There's a lot of shipping and transportation that has gone down and become more expensive. People are trying to find inputs, and I'll talk a little bit more later about what the backlog in inputs is and what's causing that. And then firms are simply exiting the market. We saw a huge exiting of especially restaurants mid-pandemic because they were closed, and they use that as an opportunity maybe to retire or to move on to do something else. I think in Utah alone, we lost about 450 restaurants in the first 6 months of the pandemic. And then we'll see firms across the food system use that as an option to make a change because of kind of the craziness, if you will, scientific term, but anyway. to that. So we've got, like I said, we've got kind of this double whammy, and that's what's really going on. So the USDA is forecasting percentage changes for 2022 in terms of the consumer price index. So this is very similar to what we just saw a couple of minutes ago. And you can see that, interestingly enough, most of their forecasted ranges for 2022, and this is based on background data that they're using and their best guess estimates, frankly, of some of the things I've already talked about, people's expectations, government spending, all these types of things. And you can see that when you look at the 20-year historical average, so that's the second to the last column, the forecast ranges include the historical average. So they're expecting things to come back to normal, I guess, more or less, you might say, with a couple of exceptions. Interestingly, some of the meats are actually expecting to be below normal, maybe as a correction to the large increases that we saw this year. They're expecting eggs, which had quite a bit increase this year, to actually be negative next year. Negative 0.5 to 0.5. And there's also a couple down there, fresh vegetables, processed fruits and vegetables are expecting to be lower than average. And so we'll see. I personally, I think it's a little optimistic, but this is the USDA forecasted CPI for 2022. All right. So probably as producers, as farmers and ranchers here, probably something that you're probably a little bit more even into than the inflation is looking at the producer price index, also called the PPI, which is the sales price that farmers and ranchers are getting basically at the farm gate. And so we're going to look at the same thing we did with the CPI, but for the PPI, with a year over year, December 2020 to December 2021, and look at the changes in pricing. And interestingly enough, like farm level cattle, wholesale beef, things like that, those price changes were actually even higher than what the consumer saw. So there's obviously been some compaction in those intermediary channels. So the processors and the delivery people, they're paying a higher price, but they're also getting a little bit lower price. So there's been some contraction there. Poultry, 26%. Look at eggs, 95% increases in pricing at the farm gate. Fruits and vegetables, much higher pricing. Wholesale fats and oils, much higher pricing. Wheat, almost 60%. So again, farmers and ranchers received quite a bit higher prices in December 2021 than they were receiving in December 2020. Again, if we look at USDA projections for producer price index for 2022, a lot of these include, the 20 historical averages, with a few exceptions. They're actually looking at negative, basically inflation for wholesale beef, so -1 to 2.0, whereas the 20-year historical average is actually 4.5%. So again, I think they're thinking that given the high increases we saw last year, there's going to be some correction in that. So just think about that. If you're producing cattle, producing beef, you may not see continued price increases for your livestock and those types of things going forward as much anyway. And then you see wholesale dairy actually is expected to, prices for that is supposed to increase way above historical average. So the historical average increase, annual increase is 2.1%. They're expecting it to be between 4 and 7% next year. Soybeans way below average. Again, that may be impacted by the current situation in Europe. And so you can see here that a lot of these fall below averages. And I think that's maybe they're thinking there's going to be some overcorrection, so some deflation there. But we'll see how it plays out. And again, this was put together before the current international situation. All right. So some upside for producers here is that producer prices, so farm gate prices, are outpacing consumer price increases. for a lot of different products, or at least they did in 2021, except for eggs and milk. The highest price increases were for meat products, so beef, poultry, vegetables, and then also things like soybeans and wheat. And USDA shows that net farm income actually went up by 20% in 2020 relative to 2019, and they're forecasting, because they're still analyzing all the data, that net farm income will actually be up 23% 2021 over 2020. So again, good news so far. I know that but you have some bad news coming from the input situation, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. So for those of you who are doing direct to consumer sales, so maybe you're doing farmers markets, CSAs, farm stand, those types of things. I know there's a lot of you at the conference, attending the conference. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Consumers are seeing higher prices at the grocery store. Okay, they're seeing them happen, maybe not for all products. And so it doesn't, if you're feeling nervous about price changes in your own operation, I would say don't. I mean, if your costs are going up and you feel like your pricing needs to change, you shouldn't be hesitant about that. I think these price adjustments are definitely warranted, especially looking at the data from how fresh vegetables and fruit pricing went up last year. And also people are buying and wanting to buy local beef and grass-fed beef a lot. There is discussion of some potential processing facilities coming into Utah and Idaho, additional ones. And we're seeing, in grass-fed beef. I'm going to come back to this slide real quickly, but I just wanted to show you the USDA report for grass-fed beef. This is nationwide for the end of January. You can see here that prices of premiums, and these for different cuts over what they're getting for commodity, for still much higher. So basically a $17 premium for ribeye steak, those types of things. As you can see, there's still a lot of movement forward in pricing, especially for things like grass-fed beef here. Also, COVID-based shortages on demand for local foods remain. So there's still really strong demand for purchasing local and buying locally. And we're still seeing farmers markets, CSA memberships levels way above 2019 levels. So, and that was at least from the 2021 summer last season. Obviously the 2022 season has not yet started yet, at least in the Intermountain West. But I'll actually be looking into what's going on in some of the states that have already started the season, such as California and some of the other states, and kind of see if that's still going to be up for basically the third year in a row. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay, I've got, looks like plenty of time. I said 45 minutes, and I've got about 15 minutes left. Okay, so another media stories you may have seen, supply chain crunches are affecting every corner of agriculture. That's true. And a lot of it has to do because of shortages, the availability of inputs. A lot of consumers are ordering, and so a lot of the containers aren't available. A lot of boxes, bags. I don't know if you've been to the grocery, sometimes the grocery store lately, they don't have bags and they want you to bring your own bags. Anyway, there's a lot of things going on, and they're affecting the input and the cost side for producers. Okay, so what are some of the reasoning behind the supply chain issue? And of course, we have supply chain issues, and we got shortages, things are happening, and we're also seeing increased prices. So immense online ordering. Okay, this is coming from a lot of the consumer side. We're also seeing producers order early and order a lot, or maybe too much. Okay, and so that is really impacting our transportation capacity. I see multiple Amazon trucks in the same place on a daily basis. Okay. And that's just the end delivery part, but the number of trucks on the road and increasing fuel costs, again, packaging materials. I mean, there's just so much ordering that's happening online. And of course, that all has to be delivered, has to be separately packaged. It's much different than just going to, Costco and filling up your complete, your bin at Costco or your cart at Costco. I mean, they come, or say you get 10 items and, they put 2 in each box, and then there's 5 boxes, and who delivered by, 3 separate delivery trucks again. So as you can imagine, that is one of the main causes of the supply chain issues we're seeing. Over ordering, again, people are ordering too much. I mean, we saw this, it was kind of a bit of jokingly, but we saw this with toilet paper at a couple of different times during the pandemic. Lack of packaging materials available due to clogs in the shipping. A lot of those packaging materials are made overseas, and they can't get into the ports very well. There have been labor shortages. People are requesting a lot higher wages to go to work. Talked about that a little bit. Transportation stress, fuel price increases. They aren't a number of trucks, aren't the number of ships needed for the demand that we have. And then more importantly, cost of fertilizers and other inputs have really gone up. Fertilizer was up 300% in 2021. And we also have bans on some fertilizer imports due to trade issues. I think this is frankly, unfortunately, only going to get worse with the situation in Ukraine and some of the things that we're economically going to try to do with Russia to keep them from continuing. Anyway, for example, corn is used in a lot of products, and lack of fertilizer is causing reductions in corn production. And so, again, when they don't have product, I saw, unfortunately, I think yesterday they're expecting fertilizer prices to go up as high as maybe 300 or 400% more again. Producer told me recently, I waited a year for my jars and they basically were putting fruit products into jam and putting the jars. And so it's not uncommon. It's happening, unfortunately. Okay. So where are the shortages primarily? So the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture did a survey of producers across the nation in 2021. And as you can see, there was kind of equally across fertilizer and herbicides, and I would say farm machinery parts, producers had difficulty purchasing from suppliers. Okay, insecticides not quite as much. And this doesn't cover all the potential inputs, but I think it gives you a general idea that across the board, producers are having a hard time necessarily getting what they need from suppliers. And here is, actually I was wrong about it's 80%. So Texas A&M Ag and Food Policy Center suggests that fertilizer price could increase by more than 80% for the 2000 planting season. So that's almost 100% more than the cost last year. So if you were paying, $300 a ton, you might end up paying, close to $500 a ton this year. So again, unfortunately, I think the situation going on in Europe might even make that more difficult. So I wanted to talk about some suggestions. And I pulled this from some colleagues, and we've talked about those. We're actually writing paper kind of on this right now, because obviously working in extension and working with producers, we want to help in some way and provide some. So these are kind of vague maybe. And I don't have, a lot of drop down statistics, but some of the suggestions are that how producers might deal with some of these is to, secure orders early. So not over order, because that only compound the problem, but try to secure those early. Maybe do pre-buying. I know like seeds have been especially difficult to get by, especially with all of a lot of the normal average person is putting in more gardens and doing a lot more home gardening. That's especially been an issue. And then of course, fertilizer. Prices are high, and you might want to secure that in ahead of time. So that's the second thing, which is lock in pricing ahead of time. Large agricultural producers, they have contracts for a lot of their inputs as well as their outputs. And so I would maybe talk to whoever you've been buying from, try to lock in an amount and a price ahead of time. And whether that's a written contract or not, that depends on obviously on the, the past experiences you have with that particular supplier, but that would be highly suggested. Also source locally when available, and support the local person. That way you're more likely to find things that you need. then, and they can look around for you. I know a lot of local providers, they have networks and they could try to pull in stuff from their network from around the country or even globally. Maybe consider using multiple types of packaging. Like I know a lot of producers who may be using jars or now using plastic bottles, and using labeling that they can easily apply to different types of packaging. And then sharing equipment and parts. So that, again, that seems a little odd, but if you're looking at sharing equipment with your neighbor, maybe rotating, and those types of things. So anyway, that's what we're talking about nationally as far as initial strategies to deal with this. And I'm sure we'll be coming out with a lot more information and specifics as we work on this project as a group. All right. Some resources to kind of track what's going on. The Economic Researchers has the food price outlook, which I shared. And they also going to have that for both consumers and farm gate pricing. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has their economic data. They have a lot of information there on inflation in different sectors, inflation in other areas of the world. Also, if you're looking at current pricing, across the United States, you can get that at the specialty crop prices through the Agricultural Marketing Service. And then if you're involved with local beef production or grass-fed beef production, you can kind of find out what's going on nationally with those prices at the National Grass-Fed Beef Report. It comes out about every 3 weeks and it's updated. And again, it's national, which is great. They used to just have it for certain regions and not other regions, but they've continued to do that. So that's all I have for now. So I'll go ahead and take questions for the next 8 minutes or so, the rest of my time. Ruby or Karen, if you want to read those for me, that might be good.
So I don't think we've had any questions pop up in there. So just type your questions in the Q&A if you have those, and then Kinda will talk about those. But I felt like this is a lot of really good information to kind of sort through. When you go back to that list of resources page, Kinda, that you had just before here, what, kind of like sometimes I think you can feel like it's an information overload, for the producer and me too. What would you say might be some of the places that you would just kind of key into to kind of, keep track of things? Or
yeah, okay, let me go back and what I showed you here real quickly. So you can download this spreadsheet. It's in Excel, and there's like they update it about every 2 months, and you can easily download this. Anyone can, from the website that I have shown you there. And you can see here, for instance, this is a producer price index. And you can look at what the averages were, what the annuals were by year, what the forecasted for all of these different products. And now these are large level products. So wholesale pork, I mean, they don't have it for necessarily for individual specific items in this report, but they do have other reports available. And again, you can just download it. And some of them actually come in graphical form, which makes it really easy to see for specific to specific fruits, specific vegetables, specific types of meats. And so if you're primarily a small vegetable grower, you can get this report and you say, I specialize in, I don't just put something onions. You can get a report like this for onions if you want. And again, it's national. It's not necessarily differentiated. So it's not organic, or it's not, grown locally. Again, you have to make some price changes when you have a specialty product, something like that. And so the Agricultural Marketing Service, though, does have pricing for organic products nationwide. It's not in this kind of easily viewable form as much, but you can download a spreadsheet for, say, organic corn for the last 30 years and look at the trends there with prices, both at farm gate and retail. Then Agricultural Marketing Service also has prices for major products at different wholesale markets. So they've got like the San Francisco wholesale market. They call them terminal markets. At the there's one in Atlanta, one in New York, and in different parts of the country. The closest one for us is San Francisco. And so that's what they're saying. This is the wholesale price of all products and on basically all the West. Is the San Francisco is the only one we have for, 16 Western states. But anyway, and so you can get a really good idea of the pricing that's, nationally or regionally, and even by product sometimes for strawberries or, for raspberries or those types of things.
So the question came in, would this be a good guide for determining pricing for producer vendors at farmers markets?
No. This is, again, national, more commodity pricing. So USU Extension, so myself, graduate student, Ruby, we actually collected farmers market pricing data for 2 years, 2016, 2017, and did some outreach on that, did some workshops, put all that data online. We unfortunately do not have the funding to continue to watch that. But I would say that the best, when you're first starting out at farmers market, you need to look at the pricing of the people selling similar products at that farmers market. And there's some negative incentive from people who price a lot under, so keep that in mind. But you can do some pricing shopping, do some average pricing shopping. That's a good place to start. Colorado State University has farmers market pricing in about 6 different markets in Colorado that they publish on their website, and they continue to keep up with that. You see a little bit higher pricing in Colorado than Utah, but obviously the greater Denver area is very, very close, if not equal to what we would see in the Salt Lake area. So, very comparable. And if you want to look at data over multiple years, the Colorado State farmers market.
And can you post or find those links and then post those in the chat?
Yeah, I can do that later once I've got
that's
out
perfect.
the presentation.
And then since those will be in the chat, we'll keep track of those and we'll post them back to the website. And then there was another question saying, is there more specific information through USDA or other things about how pricing has changed for Utah, or did they just evaluate as a country as a whole?
A country as a whole, yeah.
Okay. And so my other question is, given all of this information, going into this next season, a lot of times we might see kind of where prices, how much they've gone up in the past, but we might need to set our prices for the whole next year for like our CSAs and other types of things. And we don't really know where input prices are going to go. So do you just kind of go somewhere in between? I mean, everything, we don't know a lot of things. So you know what I mean? It's not business owners.
Well, as you know, Ruby, there's consumer demand and what they're willing to pay. Okay. And even if your prices go up by 80% as far as your inputs, if consumers aren't willing to pay the price for your product that includes that, then you have an interesting decision to make. As you say, the profit function right, has to be considered. And if your costs go up, then basically your prices have to go up too. But there's only what the consumer will bear. Again, I would take a real good look at where others stand in those markets, especially the experienced growers. And take a look at that and do some financial analysis. I think looking at worst case scenarios on your costs, what if my costs go up by 30% in total, or what if I have certain costs that go up by 80% as the Ag Policy Center and Texas A&M is predicting, and do some sensitivity analysis with that. So play a little around with your financials, make sure you know where you are for this next year. As you can see from these resources I've put up here, there's a lot of unknowns about what's going to happen in the next year. And, they're saying if this happens, we might end up with sunny skies, or we might end up with showers, right? And I think that's why the weather report scenario is so fun to look at, because, they get the weather report wrong a lot. So
I also want you to put that slide back up. I'm not sure which slide it is. Maybe it's the resources page while you're answering the questions, please. And then
okay, resources. Okay.
Yeah, if that's not the right page, then just type something in again. And then also somebody noted that lumber prices, dollars per 1,000 square board feet, dropped 25% overnight immediately after the Federal Reserve announced it was increasing interest rates. Obviously, there was a lot of speculation in lumber. Is that likely in agriculture inputs as well?
Um, well, I'm gonna say I don't have a lot of background specific to lumber. I do know that the cost of building houses has skyrocketed, and the increasing price of lumber has played a large role in that of late. And also getting supplies of lumber has also had shortages. Again, a lot of it due to the shipping and those types of things. Our lumber only comes from a few places in the United States. And when the Fed says they're going to increase prices, that means increase interest rates. That means the price of obtaining money is going to go up, and that means they're trying to dampen the economy, trying to get people to not spend beyond their means. If you have to borrow money and you have to pay more to borrow that money, essentially the interest rate that you pay, then people are going to back off on their spending. And so that's a way of controlling interest rates, is to, controlling the inflation rate is to increase interest rates. And so, you're going to see, as people react to that information, you're going to see across the board changes in the economy a little bit, but maybe not as much as the lumber price drop here of 25%. Just based upon the announcement that the Fed might increase interest rates, we saw interest rates for home loans go up by almost 0.5 point immediately, which is a lot. And that's just on speculation. That's the banks going, oh, yay, right? But that doesn't mean it'll stay that way. And whether they do it or not at the next meeting, which I think is in early April, that may really, if they just say we're going to do it, if they don't do it again, people will stop trusting what they're going to say. And so their ideas about that, the future will change and spending will go up again.
Okay,